In this lab I want to pick up a toy with the robot and place it on a conveyor belt. I added a trace at the top of the hard hat so we can follow where the position of that component goes, and also at the center of this circle and at the center of this circle. So I'll display every 20th slide in my motion, and so let's rewind this and I'll play it again. So it goes over, picks up my component, and puts it over on the conveyor belt. I'll then go to the output grapher. I wanted to export these traces into the individual components. I was able to do that, but it was so slow that it was not really usable. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this to Studio. I'll expand my timeline and I'm going to set the time play periods for 15 seconds. And I will go to the animation favorites. I'll right click on the simulation timeline and I'll animate simulation timeline parameters, and so I'll save for 6.5 seconds. And actually I need to put in the number of calculations, so 650 calculations, and I did that in 6.5 seconds. We'll say OK to that. And so here is our motion now in the Inventor Studio environment. So if I take the playhead back to the beginning, and if I play this, we can set this to operate in whatever time period that we want. And if we want to zoom in on a particular location, perhaps we create a camera. And so I'm going to create a camera view here, so I'll right click, and I've already got one camera. Let's just turn off the visibility of that camera, and I'll create a new camera from this view, and I don't need to have it visible to use it, so I'll go ahead and turn off the visibility of this one, but I need to make one of those cameras active. I'm going to make camera 2 active, and then maybe I want to zoom into a particular location, and I will add a camera action for that zoom, and I'm going to then put that zoom period to occur from 6.5 seconds to maybe the 15 seconds. And so if I play this, so we'll see it do the pickup, it'll go over, and then it'll zoom in on that location. And maybe while it's zooming in on that location, I want to repeat this operation. Now I could either repeat it or maybe I'll mirror this operation, so I'll do mirror, and then I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit faster maybe. So let's bring that zoom time back to say it occurred in this area, and then I will go back to the beginning, and I'll get my player out of the way, and then I'll play it. So it goes over, picks up the part, places it on the conveyor, then I'll zoom in. I'm going to go reverse and put it back where it was. Now maybe I want to zoom in there a little bit faster, and so I'll put that zoom period to occur really quickly in this area, and so we'll play this again. So it goes over, it picks up the component, puts it on the conveyor. I'll zoom in, I'll pick up the component and put it back where it was. Now let's take a look at how to set this up. In this lab I want to use the robot to pick up a separate part, and I'll add an additional challenge of placing it at some location. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the View tab, and I'm going to go to the lighting style, and I'm going to set the lighting style as Old Warehouse. And then if I zoom out, our environment is not appropriate size for the size of our model, and so I'm going to change the size of the environment. So I'll go back up to the lighting style and I'll go to settings, and then I'm going to increase or decrease the size of the environment so that our part looks to be appropriate size, and then I will rotate that as well to get it the rotation that I want. Now I may need to do this a couple of times to get the angle that I want. I'm going to go ahead and save and close on that, and I'll zoom in here. So here I see my environment. Now I may want to move this closer to a wall, in which case I would need to move it from the origin. But before I unground this part and move it, I would like to get all of the joints placed in here, and then we can safely move the entire assembly if we desire. So I'm going to delete this part that is named cheese block, and we'll use a second component. So I'll delete this one, and then I'm going to place the toy called Foosman, and I'll put that someplace on the screen. And then I'm going to set this so that this circle is in the center of this rectangle. And to do that, I'm going to split this face. And so I will shift right mouse button, and I'll go to part priority with my selection filters. And then I'll open up this component, and I will do a new sketch on this face. And let's go around to the top view, and I will either turn on the visibility of the previous sketch, or I'll simply project geometry, and I'll get a couple of corner points here, and I'll draw a rectangle from corner to corner, or a line from corner to corner of the rectangle. I'll change that to construction line, and then I'm going to draw a circle at the center of this, and this could be any size. Let's do 0.75. So we just need a circle that we can use to split that face. And so then I'll finish this sketch, and I'll do split. I'll select this circle, I'll select this face that I want to split, and so now I have a circle that I can use for insert. I'll save this. I'll go back to my assembly, and I'll do constraint, insert. I will select this circle, and I will select this face, and I'll say OK to that. And then I may want to rotate this around to 90 degrees, and I can either just do it by eye, or I could put in a constraint to one of the origin planes to line that up precisely. In the real world, we might not have something exactly placed, and so I'm just going to leave it by eye. And then I'm going to suppress, though, that insert constraint that I used to place this, and I might give this a name, and so I'm going to call this place toy. And then I'll give myself a reminder of suppress this. Okay, so anytime I need to get that back, I can just unsuppress that constraint. And that might be another good reason to put a constraint between the planes going through the center of this, so that we could get that back in the same place. But I'm going to just leave it the way it is. And then we'll go through our process again. And so this is a practice to get used to the issues that might arise. And sometimes you'll do something one way, and then the next time you try do the same thing, or at least what you think is the same thing, and you get an error. So I'm going to drag this over a little bit. I'll do constraint, and I'm going to select this axis, and I'll select this point. And so I have that first one done. I will then do this axis, and I will do this point. I have that one done, and I will do this axis, and I'll do this point, and then I will do the plane between the two arms here and the plane in the center of this arm. So first I need to locate those. So let's just move this down a little bit so we can see, and we can also do the point line. We'll go ahead and do that point line now. And so I'll select this axis, and I'll select the point. So that puts that up onto that location. I'll do the same thing over here. So I'll do constrain, I'll do this axis, I'll do this point. But if we test this out, this component, and actually I may have already had that constraint in here because I try to move it and it is not moving. But let's put this on to flexible, and so I will find that wrist tendons subassembly, and I'll set that to flexible. And then when I try to move this, so I see that I already have it centered, and so I don't need to put in that constraint. If it did come off of center, of course I'd put that plane to plane constraint. I will then make the finger assembly flexible, and I will also make the finger muscle flexible, and I'm going to then constrain, and I want the axis of this hole to the point at the center of this circle, apply that, and then the axis of this hole to the center of that circle, and I'll apply that. And then I may need to move some things around, but we'll try to just get it the way it is. So I'll do constraint, insert. I'll get the top of the circle on this hole to the bottom circle on this hole, and when I did that, the constraint didn't appear correctly, and so I'll go ahead and do the last one and then see if I get everything to work. So as soon as I hit apply, then it snapped to position. I'll get the insert on this to the insert on this one, and again I'll say apply, and when I do, it moves into position. And then I will make the wrist muscle flexible, I will make the bicep muscle flexible, and I'll make the shoulder muscle flexible. And then the hand assembly is this geometry that's all tied together, so it doesn't need to be flexible. And so then I'll save this, and then we'll go to dynamic simulation and we'll put the initial position for all of the joints. So let's go ahead and save this. Maybe this environment represents our factory floor, which we could model if we so desired. But suppose we want to move this robot back into this corner. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll go back and I'll unsuppress the placement of the toy so that it doesn't lose position. And then I might go to the top or the side view. And remember, we rotated this environment earlier, and so it's at an angle. And I'm going to drag this, and when I tap to drag it, I see that I get the locked or grounded symbol. So I'll unground this, and then I'm going to move this over into the area of this corner someplace. And now if I rotate around, I have this placed in this corner. Maybe I want to move it towards the back a little bit. And again, remember that we went into the View tab, and under the settings for that environment, we set a rotation here, and so we may or may not want to adjust that now as well. And then I would still like to move this back a little bit, but perhaps I'll just leave it right here in this position. And then we'll set our home positions for all of the joints. And so I will unsuppress, and I could just leave the toy placement suppressed for now, but I'll suppress that joint so that the toy can move. I'll then go to dynamic simulation. Before we go into dynamic simulation, make sure that you have your flexible subassemblies so that you don't get an over-constrained condition. So I'll go to dynamic simulation, and when I did that, for some reason it moved the environment and some of my components. I'll finish simulation, and I'll go back to the assembly environment and notice that some of my components are out in space. So I'll go to the Manage tab and I'll do Rebuild All, and everything becomes constrained again, even if it is in an unusual position. I forgot to ground the assembly, and notice also that it's moving relative to the environment. And also I noticed that I'll need to constrain my toy. So let's look at how to do that. Now I'll put the insert back on the toy. If I examine my origin, I'll find the plane that is at the bottom of my assembly, and I'll constrain that plane to the bottom of the robot, and then I will drag some of these components up, and notice that the environment moves as I move my robot. And so I need to go to the View tab and go to the ground plane settings, and I want to set the ground plane where it's at. I don't want the ground plane to move, so I'll say OK to that. And now if I move these components where it goes below the ground, it disappears once it goes below the ground, but the ground itself, the environment, doesn't move. So I just zoomed out, and so then once I've located this where I want it, I will then ground the base assembly. So I have it placed in my factory on my floor. I have it placed on my factory floor in the location where I want it. And now I will go back to dynamic simulation. And again, before I go to dynamic simulation, I'm going to suppress the place constraint for the toy so that it can move, and then I'll save it. I'll go to environments, and I'll go back to dynamic simulation. Okay, so we don't have an over constrained condition, and so now we can go in and put the initial positions for each one of our joints. So the first one I will do is the shoulder muscle, and so I need to come over and I'll find that joint. I will go to the properties of that joint, and then I will go to see that the initial position where it is right now is at 4.042. I'm going to change that initial position to 3.0 0.795, and I'll say OK to that, and it'll move it to that position. I'll then go to the bicep muscle, go to properties, and for the initial position for this joint, I'm going to set that at 4 inches, and then I'll go to the wrist muscle. So I need to find the prismatic joint for the wrist muscle, and I'll go to the properties, and I'm going to set the initial position for the wrist muscle at 4 inches. And then I will go to the prismatic joint for the finger muscles, and I'll go to the properties of this joint, and I'm going to set that as 3.5 inches. Now when I did that, I see that for some reason this joint I lost, and either I forgot to put it in or I lost it, the constraint, and then the fingers are, I need to fix those. So that could have happened when I moved everything around, but let's go back to the modeling environment, and I will go back to Manage tab. I'll do Rebuild All so that those components stay where they are, and then if I go to this joint and I attempt to move it, and so somehow I didn't get that constraint put on here, so I'll do my constraint. I'll do this axis to this point. Okay, so now that moves that into position, and then I will get the fingers in a valid condition. I might have to temporarily suppress a constraint to do that, and so I will go to the finger muscle and I'll turn off flexibility, and then I'll try to drag this around, and so that might not have been the best choice, so I'll ground the hand assembly, and then I'll attempt to move the fingers around, and so I'm not able to move the fingers as long as I have the finger muscle set as not flexible, so I'll put that back to flexible. So now I'm able to move these around. These are the strategies that you'll use when things aren't set up exactly the way you intended. Alright, so now I've got the fingers set up right. I've got that joint put in here the way it should be, or the constraint that will be converted to a joint. I will unground the hand assembly. I'll go back to dynamic simulation, and when I did that, I likely moved some of my initial positions, so I'm going to go back through and check all of the initial positions and make sure that they are where I intended. So I'll go in the reverse order. So I'll go to my finger muscle, and so I'll go here and I'll say properties, and my intention was for that to be at 3.5. Type in 3.5. Now again, if it says something like 3.499999999, that is 3.5 when we round it off. So we can accept that, and then we'll go to the wrist muscle, and I'll verify that position. I'll go to the properties, and for the wrist muscle, I want that at 4 inches, the initial position. And then for the bicep muscle, I'll go to that, edit the properties, and I want that to be 4 inches. And then I'll go to the shoulder muscle, I'll go to the properties, and I want the initial position on this to be 3 inches. And then I'll start to set up the motions. So I'm going to go into the edit and pose motion, and I'll enable, I'll set position, and I'll click on the input grapher, and I want this to go out to 5 seconds. So I'm going to cancel out of this, and I'm going to put my time here to 5 seconds. Alright, then we'll go to the wrist motion, and I thought I saw that move right when I did that, or the shoulder motion. So I'll go to the properties, I'll go to the position, make sure that that is on the 3 inches initial position. And so I didn't say OK to that earlier, so now I've accepted that position, and this would be a good time to save it too. So I have my initial positions all set up, and then we'll put the motions. So I'll go to the shoulder muscle, I'll go to the properties, and the initial position 3 inches. I'll go to enable and pose motion. I want to set the position on the input grapher, and then for time 0, I want this to be at the initial position, the 3 inches. I'm going to put a point here at about 1 second, and I'm going to put another point over here at about 4 seconds. And so I'll go back to the first sector, and in the first sector at time 1 second, I want this to be at the initial position still, so it dwells between 0 and 1. And then I'll go to the next sector, and I want the next sector to end at 4 seconds. And then I will set that position at 4 seconds. I want this to be, and I actually made a mistake because I actually want to change the position back here, but I'll go ahead and put in the 4 seconds. I want that to be at 3.795. And so I'll go back to the previous sector. I actually want it to dwell at that position, and so I want this one to be at 3.795. And when I did that, it moved this sector, so I'm just going to copy this. So I'll Control C to copy that. I'll go to the next sector, and I'm going to put that as the ending position, and I'll hit the tab key. It dwells between 1 second and 4 seconds. I'll go to the next sector, and I want to go back to the initial position. I want that to end at 5 seconds, and I'll set this to the initial position. Okay, so I start at the initial position of 3 inches, and then I go to 3.795 over the first second. I stay at that position until 4 seconds, and then at 4 seconds, between 4 and 5, I will go back to the 3-inch initial position. We'll say OK to that, and I'll say OK, and let's go ahead and save this. I'll then go to the bicep muscle, and I'll go to the properties, and I'll check my initial position, 4 inches. I'll go to the input grapher, and I'm going to graph the position, and so I want it to start at the initial position, so I'll right click, I'll select initial position. We see it says 3.99998, you know, that is 4. Now we can change it to 4 if we want. It rounds off to 4 in any case. And then I actually decided I want that between 0 and 1 second, so I'll add a point, and so I'll put that as 1 second, put in the 4 at that location. I'll hit the tab key, next sector, and I'm going to add a point at 2 seconds, and so I'll put in 2 seconds down here, and then at 2 seconds I want it to go to 4.25. Then I will put a point at 3 seconds, and I want it to stay at that same location, 4.25. And then I'll go to the next sector, and at the next sector I want it to go between 3 to 4 seconds, so I'm going to set this time at the ending time at 4 seconds. Actually, I started to place the distance. I want 4.3 for the distance or position, and I'll set that at 4 seconds, and then it'll stay there at 5 seconds. I'll say OK to that. Then I'll go to the wrist muscle, and I'll change the properties of that. For the initial position, I want it at 4, and I will go to the enable impose motion, the position, click on the input grapher. I'll set the initial position at 4 inches. And again, we rounded that off, it is 4. And then I will create a point at 1 second, and I want it to still be at 4, and then I'll create a point at 2 seconds, and at 2 seconds I want it to be at a position of 2.9, and then at 4 seconds I want it to be at that same position, so at 4 seconds 2.9, and then at 5 seconds I want it to be at 3. I'll say OK to that. I'll go to the finger muscle, and I'll change the properties of that. My initial position is at 3.5. I'll enable my impose motion. We'll go to position, the input grapher, and I'm going to create a point at 2 seconds. So at time 0 to time 2, I want that to be at the initial position, and then I'll go to the next sector, and let's put a point in here at 3, so I'll add a point at 3. So at 3 seconds I want this to go to 2.85, and then I want it to stay at that position to 5 seconds, so again 2.85. And then I'm going to add another point here at 6 seconds, so we'll have to increase our simulation player time. And so I'll put this at 6 seconds, and I want that position to be at 3.39. I'll say OK to this graph, and then we will run it to test it out. Now we haven't set the 3D contacts yet, so I'm going to go ahead and click the player, and so we see that it goes over. Now I played that to 5 seconds. The fingers actually open up at 6 seconds. So we'll put this on 6 seconds, and I might put it a little bit past that. I'm going to do 6.5 seconds. And then I'm going to put the 3D contacts on here. And so I'll do insert joint, and I'll do a 3D contact between this component and the base. I'll do a 3D contact between this finger and this component, and I'll do a 3D contact between this finger and the component. And I'm not sure what I did there. At some point I picked the wrong order. So let's check our 3D contact. So I have the 3D contact between the toy and the base, and between this finger and the toy. Let's go ahead and turn on gravity. So I'm going to define gravity, and I'll flip that direction. And I'll put that 3D contact then between this component and this component. I'll save it before I run it. I'll run the simulation again. So I see that my 3D contacts were ignored. We'll rewind this. I'll make sure that my toy is in the mobile group, and I see that it isn't. It's in the grounded group. So I'll insert joint, and I'll do a spatial, and I will select this component, and for the origin I'm going to set it at the center of this circle. And then I'll do the second component, and I'll select this component, and for the origin I'll put it at the center of this circle. We'll say okay to that. Let's make one more change while we're in here. Let's go to the 3D contacts, and I'll select the first one. I'll hold the shift key down. I'll select the last one, and I'll go to the properties of the 3D contact, and then for the friction value I'm going to set that to 0.2. We'll say okay to that. We'll save it, and we'll run the simulation again. So I'll click to run the simulation again. Once the simulation has solved, we can rewind, and perhaps we want to only display every 10th slide or every 20th slide. And I will then play this again. And so it'll go over, it will position, it'll pick up the part, and it'll discard the part. So the next challenge then is perhaps we want to put the part onto a conveyor belt.